Welcome to a very British conversation hosted by Nicholas Davies and myself, William Donaldson. Today, in episode 1, we're going to be talking about HMS Hood, and today's episode is titled The Mighty Hood. So, I'm joined by, as I say, Nicholas Davies. So, how the devil are you?
I'm devilishly good, sir. How the devil are you, sir?
Not too bad, not too bad. It's been one of those difficult days, should I say. I work in this incredible shop. We sell militaria, guns, antiques. And for me, as you might be wondering and you might understand from listening to these podcasts, I do love militaria and all things history. So I actually work on the gun floor. And this is how I actually met Nick. And let's just say it's been a little bit difficult. It's like a young child in a sweet shop today, Nick.
I know, so I do love that shop, actually. It has claimed much for my wallet, actually, but quite happy. I'm willingly to give it up.
I know you're directly paying my monthly wage, so thank you ever so much. I do appreciate the support.
You're most welcome.
But yes, how have you been, old sir?
Not too bad, actually. Probably not as exciting as your job at the moment, actually, but certainly can't complain, actually, but certainly enjoying delving into the archives of history, which I believe that you will be visiting a certain archive, sir.
Yes, definitely. Next month, February, I'm off up to London again for a 2-day visit up to the National Archives at Kew. Have you been before, Nick?
No, I haven't, actually. It is somewhere that I desperately need to go. So we're researching my great-grandfather with his journey through Royal Artillery with the 117th Heavy Axe. So we know he was in Normandy. We know where he landed. We know he was at Gold Beach. We roughly know where his battery were deployed. We're just trying to sort of piece together the whole journey, really. And I think you've got a link to Royal Artillery as well.
Yes, I do. I mean, one personally, and the other not connected to obviously my family, but I might as well dive into that. You know, this is I think what this bloody podcast is about. You know, going off on tangents, but so there's two elements that I'd like to read. Well, going to research anyway. So the connection with John Dunford Slater, the commanding officer of the Number 3 Commando. In fact, John was the first commando of the Second World War, interestingly enough, and his connection to the Royal Artillery is the 23rd Medium and Heavy Training Regiment, which was based down in Plymouth in 1940, and I'm currently reading his memoirs about how incredibly dull his time was with this training regiment, and he jumped up in joy at the prospect of this letter that was sent by the War Department up in London asking for volunteers for a commando unit to be established. And obviously not much information was given at that point of time. And so I think the reason behind a lot of people joining, a lot of people volunteering, it was this mystique to the entire thing. But so that's one element of my research at Kew up in Richmond. But there's a load of other things I'm researching. So my grandfather, my other grandfather, because the listeners should already know about Michael Cassidy and his incredible story with Number 3 Commandos, which is, you know, the whole reason I'm in this mess, is my grandfather William Donaldson, or Bill Donaldson, was with the Royal Artillery over in Africa, so Operation Torch, Operation Husky, Sicily, Italy, and then later into the European campaign as a typical European campaign, so Normandy, France, that type of element to it all. So, but we don't know much about him during the Second World War. Obviously, we know a lot about him as a person, but I think is very typical of people of the time. You know, post-traumatic. You know, it is very much a big thing, Nick, and I think this is why it's such a common thing for people to say, "Oh, well, my so and so was in the war, but never spoke of it." And I think they've done that to, suppress these events that caused a lot of trauma to them. And also, got to remember, you made friends, and seeing them being shot and killed, or in some cases being blown up by artillery, is not something you want to relive.
You're right, exactly. And, prime example, I learnt from my grandfather, great-grandfather, come back from Normandy. My nan always told me that he never wanted his medals. He never collected them. It was only that a close friend of the family collected on his behalf. But unfortunately, as he's no longer here, we're trying to piece together the story. You know, it's people like you and me that go hunting for this information to make sure it's not forgotten. So no, I understand that greatly.
And I think it's also quite traumatic, also to be going through these archives. I mean, I'm not going to proclaim myself to be this incredible historian that knows everything, and this is why we'd also be discussing HMS Hood in a moment. I'm not well reversed in it at all, so I'm going to be learning as much as probably the listeners when you go off and talk about HMS Hood. And obviously, I do know a slight amount, so I'll be able to rattle off some questions or what have you. But I think that's generally the entire point, isn't it? Really, why we go off to these research facilities.
Yeah.
And I was up there in late October of 2024, which feels really weird because that was only a couple. Well, felt like a couple of days ago for me, really. And reading through the Commando War Diaries, which you can access, you can touch, you can, oddly enough, it's there, it's physical. And I think that's what many people seem to forget, that it's the National Archives. So you can go and see the letters sent between, Winston Churchill and Eisenhower, this, that, the other. And so, yeah, anyway, enough of the tangent. HMS
No,
Hood,
no.
the mighty Hood.
Yes, indeed. HMS Hood, the mighty Hood, the pride of the Royal Navy, a name that is known far and wide throughout to anybody who is in the Royal Navy and anybody who does delve into the fascinating world that is naval history. But for those who don't know, it is a fascinating ship and a fantastic story. One, sadly, with a sad and tragic end, but her name is famous for those who do know her. So
That's what I was about to
really,
say as well. Because sorry, but that's what I was
no,
going to say. Because I had a question raised to us on our social media platforms, Nick, and I think it might be worth mentioning this as well. Why is it referenced the mighty Hood if she was sunk and destroyed?
so that is a very valid question. So, in a nutshell, for that, she was the mighty Hood because she was the pride of the Royal Navy. She was the biggest. She was the most well armed. She was the fastest, and for a large portion of her career, especially during peacetime, she toured the world. She flew the flag for Britain and her empire. And listening to accounts, especially from one of her survivors, Ted Briggs, said that to describe a battleship as beautiful, he said it's an instrument of war, but he said that's what she was. She was a very, very beautiful ship, very long, very streamlined, very low to the water, and
Hmm.
really that's where her name came back because she was the biggest in the Royal Navy, but she was classed as a battle cruiser, and that's the thing. It's people first stumbling block is that they call her a battleship, but no, she was a battle cruiser, and really that sort of stems to really sort of beginning of Hood. In my opinion, really begins from Jutland in 1916, which people who do know naval history, they go, well, hang on a minute, Hood wasn't at Jutland, which is absolutely correct. She wasn't. But there were ships at Jutland which met almost identical fates to Hood as well. And obviously, as we go through, we'll get to her final action.
So Jutland, for the viewers, 1916, and she was launched August 22nd, 1918. So that is an incredible feat. I mean, and how long did it take for us to build HMS? I know it's slightly different, but HMS Queen Elizabeth, the aircraft carrier,
Oh,
it was about
crikey. That's
15 years, wasn't it?
sounds about right, actually, for that one. I mean, it's the fact that Jutland itself actually influenced her design. So obviously, it was lessons learnt from Jutland, and they radically started to redesign her. So Hood is actually what we class as Admiralty class. And as you said, so yes, she was launched on 26th of August 1918, but was officially commissioned on the 15th of May 1920. So she's missed the war completely. But she's laid down in 1916 as the First World War is still going on. But it's lessons learned from Jutland. They sort of go back to the drawing board and they reevaluate her design, and
Hmm.
then obviously that unfortunate design still sort of comes back to haunt her in May of 1941 when she goes up against Bismarck. So the issue with her design, well, actually, in terms, as I said, obviously between battleship and battle cruiser. So your battleship is your big guns, your heavy armor, heavy firepower. It's there to deliver and dish out the firepower and also to take it. But the battle cruiser is slightly different. So you have something that has the firepower of a battleship, but you have the speed of a cruiser, and it's that speed that's designed to sort of get you out of trouble. However, unfortunately, you do have to sacrifice something. Unfortunately, that is in the way of armor, and that's one of the crucial issues that we do have with the battleship and the battle cruiser.
And I suppose, all this culminated in her obviously fateful and fatal ending on the 24th of May. I suppose you could argue, with that element of removing things to make her more agile, which I suppose is more needed than a dreadnought type of class of battleship where okay it's slightly different. There's different times. You don't need to be as quick because your enemy's not getting as quick, I suppose. And obviously you could argue her entire fate rested on the fact that she had weak deck armor, and and I think there's this whole type of story. I don't know. I mean, I'm not as connected to this type of research world as you are, Nick. But correct me if I'm wrong. I feel as if, from what I've been reading and watching and understanding from other people, it was oh my god, what happened to HMS Hood? Why did she sink? This is terrible. It should have never happened. Yet I don't think many people realise that she was designed intentionally to have not weaker armor, but less of it, so that she could be more agile.
Exactly, she was a lot faster, and also in terms of her design, she's very, very close to the waterline. Especially look at her stern; it's that low profile. Their designers are literally squeezing as much weight out of the ship as possible to get that speed, and she could thunder across at over 30 knots, which for a ship of her size is absolutely incredible. So she's displacing over 46,680 long tons.
It's incredible,
She's
isn't
over
it?
eight. She is massive. She's 860 feet long. So surprisingly, she's actually slightly longer than Bismarck, but she's very narrow. I mean, Portsmouth, that is the home of the Royal Navy. With Hood, she was actually built in the Clydebank of Scotland, so that's
Yes.
where her construction began. But obviously, you say because Portsmouth is the home of the Royal Navy, so that is home for her, and she was stationed at Portsmouth. Um, for a large portion of time, and she toured the world, and especially you said in terms of size. Certainly, when you compare, I've seen when both HMS Queen Elizabeth and HMS Prince of Wales have both been important. They are absolutely gigantic. They are
Yeah,
colossal.
and I always my family, because we live so close to it. It's obviously a rather a scary point for us, just in case a Russian bomber flies over and says good night everyone. But I do think we need to learn a lesson and maybe not keep both of our pride and joy in at the same time, especially at the same port. That's a topic
No,
for another day,
exactly.
probably.
Exactly. I mean, the fact, obviously, we just talked about the aircraft carrier. Really, the fate of Hood signals the end of the big gunships, and from then on, it's the aircraft carrier that then rules the waves afterwards.
Mm.
Actually, so that's why the sinking of Hood, and also then her, especially after the revenge, the Royal Navy seeking revenge on her sinking with the old famous, sink the Bismarck. It's the end. It's an end of an era, really. And obviously, the Americans certainly used the big gun battleships in the Battle of Midway, and obviously then we have our battleships out, towards the end of the war. But it's the signal. It's the lighting of the beacon that the aircraft carrier is here to stay. That's going to be the war-winning weapon at sea,
Mm.
and the battleship, in this case, the battle cruiser. Its time has come.
Yeah, but there again, it's really. I mean, obviously, we will discuss a little bit about Operation Catapult, but other than that, I mean, I don't think HMS had actually participated in any real battles. Obviously, because she was launched and commissioned in interwar period between the First World War and the beginning of the Second World War in 1939. there wasn't many opportunities for her to, get a bit of taste of war, was there?
No, you're quite right. Time of action actually wasn't as long as when you compare to the likes of other ships like things like HMS Warspite, the Grand Old Lady. So
Mm.
really, in terms of we're sort of talking about battles, it was Jutland that really influenced her design. So when we sort of harking back to that, so the issue we have from the Battle of Jutland and ships that suffered similar fates to her would be the likes of HMS Indefatigable, HMS Invincible, and HMS Queen Mary. Now, the issue that we have, and obviously you mentioned obviously about her design and weak deck armor, the issue we have is what we call plunging fire. And if we look at naval combat, if we go to, Trafalgar, the days of Nelson, Battle of the Nile, the Napoleonics, you have ships that line up alongside each other and they literally give themselves an absolute heavy broadside at close range. This is completely different when we're moving into 20th century warfare. You have, big, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15-inch guns, and you have enormous plunging, enormous shells plunging at high speeds, down onto unarmored decks. And this is unfortunately when Hood, does see her final action in 1941. This is what allegedly is what causes her fate. But her actions aren't particularly numerous. And you did mention Operation Catapult, which is the attack on Mers El Kabir. So we will get onto that as well. But slight tangent when I mentioned HMS Indefatigable, Invincible, and Queen Mary. So their fates, and some people may already know the fate of her, but those who don't, the three ships at Jutland suffered catastrophic magazine detonations. Now, a lot of people going, well, is it down to weak deck armor? Well, there are other factors to consider. And this is something that people have tried to research and look into, even when it comes to Hood, that when going into battle, Royal Naval ships are very well known for fast gunnery. You're putting a lot of shells into the air, a lot of ammunitions in the air onto the target as quickly and as fast as possible. So unfortunately, on that day in 1960 at Jutland, a lot of British ships went to battle overloaded with ammunition, cordite, shells, and unfortunately, flash doors were left open. And if anybody doesn't know what a flash door is crucial to prevent flame from entering into the magazine. And the magazine is deep in the battleship, is where all your munitions are kept. That's, you can imagine actually that an explosion there in a contained armoured space is absolutely catastrophic. And this is what happens to those three ships at Jutland. And there was the famous phrase remarked at Jutland, there seems to be something wrong with our bloody ships today. But when people have looked into it, actually, they say, was it down to, poor design? And they said, actually, no, British ships were, as in terms of compared to German counterparts, actually were on an equal par. They were still well designed, but unfortunately, the battle cruiser is still far, far more lightly armored compared to the battleship. And it's again, this will all stem, when we get to the fateful day of 24th May 1941. And when you mention Mers El Kabir, now that's
Yes.
that's a tricky one. So, what do you know of this one, sir?
Well, obviously, the fall of France, 1940, German hands, all over France now, and I feel as if there's this element of desperate. At this point, there's no Bismarck, is there? So we don't want the Germans to have some capable French ships. So my understanding of Operation Catapult is that it was necessary for the survival potentially of the Royal Navy's dominance in Europe. I mean, I might be.
No, you're on the right sort of mark actually. So you're right. So think there's a situation also that France has fallen, and you have the issue that at the beginning of the Second World War, the French have a very capable and very modern navy, a very, very modern, powerful navy. And you'll probably, and if we ever do a talk on this, later on, down the line in terms of, sort of German armor, the Germans utilize a lot of French equipment, especially in terms of tanks, and they made a very good use of them. And the Admiralty and obviously Churchill, they are absolutely terrified at the thought of the Germans getting their hands on the French fleet that were, as I said, anchored up at Mers El Kabir. in Algeria of North Africa. So the French were given an ultimatum of sailing to friendly waters to continue the fight, sailing to
Mm.
to a neutral country, or to scuttle your own ships, or the ultimatum was also that we would be forced to do it for them. We would be forced to open fire. And
And I suppose the French, being the French, they um, said, "Up you and come and get them."
it was similar on the lines of that, actually. So the French were basically stating that they were reassured that the Germans wouldn't um, commandeer their vessels, and they were saying that, if should they attempt to, don't worry, we will scuttle. But by this point, the situation is desperate. So it was it was a low ranking officer that was actually sent out to speak with the French admiral, and he was actually slightly insulted, actually, that he wasn't speaking to an officer of similar rank, and just made the decision. He said, "No, we will stay here. We've been given assurance, that the Germans won't commandeer our ships. They won't take our vessels, and if they will do, we will sink. We'll scuttle them ourselves." Unfortunately, by this point, the orders were given. Unfortunately, yes, they were given the orders to sink. And Hood was obviously part of Force H. It was Force H, and
Mm,
she was also joined by the battleship HMS Resolution. So you've got two battleships
yes.
with massive 15-inch guns, and it was described as a rather dark day of the Royal Navy, and Hood's gunnery and Resolution's gunnery were frighteningly accurate, and they absolutely smashed the French fleet at Mers El
Yes.
Kabir,
But
and
obviously,
it was
for the greater context, sorry, just to jump in, but
oh,
for the greater context, Force H was commanded by Vice Admiral James Somerville, wasn't it?
correct.
And some of the ships that the French had were also Dunkirk and Strasbourg.
Yes.
So just the general context there, and I suppose you could also say, this would have been HMS Hood's first real action in the Second World War.
That was her guns firing in anger, but fortunately, it's against our own allies. I believe that the only casualty of the British were pilot and navigator from a swordfish, so that we were dropping mines at the mouth of the harbour to prevent the French from trying to make good escape. And I believe those are
Yes.
the only casualty from the British side, actually. But the result was actually that the Germans had an absolutely huge propaganda field day with the whole thing. But that was her sort of first case. She's firing her guns in anger for the first time, but unfortunately, it's against our own allies. And this is where you have the order of battle. You have Ark Royal, you have obviously Hood, Resolution, Valiant, Enthusia, Enterprise, Active, Escort. So you have a large number of ships that have been sent out to deal with this. And you're right. So there was Dunkirk, Strasbourg, Bretagne, Provence. It's a rather sad moment, really, for Hood's career. But
Mm,
what it did, it sent a message to the one, especially to the Americans, because by this time, Churchill is furiously trying to get the Americans to sort of join in, as it were, and it did sort of make the world sort of sit up and realise that Britain was prepared to do anything necessary in order to survive. And if the Germans had, you've got the issue of the Kriegsmarine operating, then you have the French fleet, and obviously then with the Italians coming in, we would have been
I had it
furiously
equally
outgunned.
and they had it equally as capable fleet that never seemed to leave port. Well, in the later stages of the war, which I've been researching, obviously, when it comes to Sicily.
I think that would be a good separate talk in itself, especially with Warspite claiming the longest hit in naval history against
Yes.
against the Italians, and really just forced them to kind of turn around and head for home. But no, I think that'll be a good one for another day, actually. But no,
Definitely.
unfortunately, that was Hood's sort of first time she's opening her, she's firing her guns in anger. She does come under attack during the Spanish Civil War and receives minor damage due to aerial bombing, so a smaller bit of shrapnel damage. But that's really as far as it goes from the Spanish Civil War. And as people ask, why she called the Mighty Hood, but prior to that, she was touring the world.
Mm,
She flew the flag for Britain. She went everywhere, and one of the funny things actually that I learned about people, obviously, people who wanted to get a commission, obviously commanding Royal Naval vessels, is that the cleaner you kept your ship, the better chance you had of a promotion. And there were a few actually
Yes.
commanding officers that didn't like a gunnery practice because it made the ship dirty. You'd have to clean it afterwards. So Hood certainly went around looking very smart and very shiny. But yes, at the time, actually, they didn't like doing gunnery practice on because it made her a little bit on the dirty side. Not saying that British gunnery was bad by any stretch of the imagination. We were still exceptionally well trained. But when it leads on to the fateful day of the Battle of the Denmark Strait, and this is where we have what are classed as two completely different time zones colliding, really, and that's where it all
Hmm.
sort of comes together. But no, but Mers El Kabir is just one of those unfortunate little footnotes in history that it happened. So this 3rd of July 1940, and Hood opens her guns, open fire in anger. But unfortunately, it's against our allies. But for the necessary course of securing the safety and stability of our dominance as a naval power against the oncoming threat of the German and the Kriegsmarine.
Exactly. And obviously, I think before we go on to this fatal last journey of HMS Hood. So she was armed with 8 15-inch 381 millimeter guns in 4 twin stacks, or sorry, turrets. And looking at these images of HMS Hood, and I've got an image of her up now, I think how pretty damn impressive, especially being, a Frenchman at that operation, or even better still, just the physical appearance of HMS Hood would be enough. And I think this is somewhat correct as well. Just the physical appearance of her would be enough to send someone packing.
Exactly, and that's one thing you have with big gunship. They are a visual deterrent, and guns are massive. They are hugely impressive. And a
Mm,
little fact, actually, when you also have the famous HMS Rodney, who was built after Hood, actually, and her design was actually influenced by the Washington Naval Treaty. She had 16-inch guns, absolutely massive, and I believe there was one ship of the Royal Navy that actually did have an 18-inch gun. I think it was either could have been Colossus or Courageous or Glorious. One of them actually that was converted to an aircraft. They were converted to aircraft carriers. But I think one of them actually had a rear-facing 18-inch gun.
blimey.
But for the Royal Navy, 15-inch was pretty damn good actually. And then and did the job. So for Hood's her full complement. So yes, you have your 15-inch guns. You have 12 single 5.5 inch. You have 4 single 4 inch. So there's your anti-aircraft guns. You have 6 torpedo tubes. So she's pretty well armed. And obviously, as she goes through into the second one, she is kind of modified. So I know that in her early design, actually along her mid deck, she had guns situated along. Those were removed, and there was a rather strange anti-aircraft system that they mounted on top of the turrets. Actually, it was almost like a wire guide rocket sort of system, which was hopelessly inaccurate. But again, it's development of weapon and technology of the time. But no, she was well armed. But again, it's the issue of being a battle cruiser. It's just
Mhm.
sacrificing that armor. And a little old fun fact, I think I mentioned to you that because she was so low in the waterline to sort of get that speed, her mid deck and the ship was almost constantly awash with water, especially was thundering at full speed, which led to a huge number of cases of tuberculosis on board, one of the highest recorded in the Navy, which is something really to crow about. But she was also given a nickname of the largest submarine in the Royal Navy. Somebody years back said, "Well, was it because she was sunk?" I went, "No, not quite. It was purely because she was so close to the waterline." But because
Yes.
of that design, she could thunder across at over 31 knots. And it was mentioned at Mers El Kabir when they saw her thundering past. They said it was incredible. It was like a speedboat. Admittedly, an 860-foot long one, but they said she absolutely thundered past.
And I think for the general understanding of, the crew on board, I was reading the other day that, well, actually, no, I wasn't reading. I was watching this video on HMS Hood leaving Portsmouth, and these other historians talking about Hood, and I was reading these other elements about her. The crew on board in 1935 would have been the same some sort crew in 1941, because at that time in Royal Naval history, you serve a commission, don't you, on the ship?
Yeah,
Um, and seeing these faces, you going by their everyday business, doing their job on HMS Hood, and probably coming to the realization that actually these poor young men, and most of the time, you've got to understand that you could have been 16 in the Royal Navy, and even younger sometimes, I believe.
yeah.
Um, you know, these poor boys didn't, had everything but fear. Um, and it must have been such a brutal time, um, for them, because they're so young, they don't know what to expect. Um, but and out of I know I'm jumping the gun a little bit here, and we tend to probably do this a lot during this podcast. But out of what 1,400 crew and officers, there was three survivors,
Correct. There
and
were only three survivors, and
so you've got obviously Ted Briggs, which I think that there's a huge story with him though, isn't he? Because I believe he was the one who done a lot of speeches, this, that, the other about it, didn't he? But and I think three survivors out of 1,400, give or take, is incredibly poignant. But yeah, so as we move on to the fateful part of her life.
indeed. I mean, one thing I'll give a little fun fact. Actually, obviously you mentioned about obviously the survivors here. You had Ted Briggs, Robert Tilburn, and William John Dundas, who were the only survivors. But another member of Hood's crew, a little unknown fact. So, anybody who was a Doctor Who fan out there, actually, the actor John Pertwee, who I believe was the third Doctor Who, he was a crew member of HMS Hood. So he spent 6 years aboard her and was transferred off. So I believe he went onto naval intelligence. I believe I had to look into that. But when he was transferred, it wasn't long transferred off. Actually, not long before she went out after Bismarck in 1941. So that's a little kind of pub knowledge quiz fact there, actually, that Doctor Who himself actually did serve aboard HMS Hood. So it was a little unknown one there.
So a
Yes,
little
we
bit of
move.
information about Ted Briggs. So he joined the Royal Navy as a teenager, and according to what I've read about him, he was fascinated with all things ships, and I think that's quite the same with a lot of young boys. I mean, I was quite fascinated with ships, as I said in the introduction podcast. Spending a lot of time with my grandmother, looking at the home of the Royal Navy, and I think that's quite correct, and I'm almost certain you're the same. But in 1938 he was 16. So again, such a young age, and assigned to HMS Hood as a signal boy.
Yeah. No, absolutely
Um,
spot on. I mean, age-wise, actually, you're right. Actually, a lot of children do sign up very young. My granddad, who served in Korea with the Sea-class destroyers, he joined at 14, which is absolutely insane. I think the youngest recorded serving person in the Royal Navy is actually put at naught. It was a child that was born on board a ship in the Royal Navy. So we're going back into the days of the Napoleonics. But a child that was born on board a ship and his name was written into the logs, and it was put as age as naught. So history says being the youngest serving person aboard a British ship.
Blimey.
A
so,
little bit,
so,
a little
so,
bit of
so
one there.
exactly, and I suppose to take us on this journey from, because she obviously so alongside HMS Prince of Wales, who was alongside HMS Hood
Yes.
during the actual run to the Denmark Strait. So for the viewers, the Denmark Strait is between Greenland and Iceland. It's an area that is quite impassable, which is not when it's not in the summer period. And you know, but first of all, why So how did all this come about? So obviously the British spotted Bismarck, and the Bis the Bismarck was such a threat to the Royal Navy at 1940. Well, 1940 was launched, this, that, the other. The Royal Navy was the senior service. It was the part of Europe that was so essential to the war effort. And I think at any cost, it was worth it to try and take out Bismarck. and I read that in a
exactly.
document a couple of days ago.
No, you're
And
spot on. It was absolutely crucial. So the thing with Bismarck is that she was used as a commerce raider, and very similar to another German ship, the the pocket battleship, I should say, Graf Spee, who quite frankly could be considered a battle cruiser. You have big heavy guns, but with pretty light on the old armor front. But Bismarck was primarily going to be used to literally disrupt and try to put as much shipping, bringing supplies to Britain, actually, to the bottom of the sea as possible. So it was absolutely crucial that she was stopped. And Bismarck was joined by the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen. You're quite right. So she was spotted. So naval intendants were using everything at their disposal to spot her, and it was actually a Catalina flying boat being flown by an American pilot, which is a little unknown. So the Americans a lot of it did come over and volunteer to fight alongside us, even though by this point the Americans haven't really joined the war. So it won't be until December when the Japanese awaken the sleeping giant, and then all hell kind of breaks loose from there. But no, Bismarck was
again, another element where someone attacks someone's ships.
yeah.
I feel like this is some sort of contingency plan.
I know there seems to be a lot of sort of actually people sort of touching the boats again, but it is a case of she had to be stopped at all costs. And when we look at Bismarck's design, she is a thoroughly modern ship, and she is a battleship. But she also displays 8 15-inch guns, but she has modern rangefinders. Her armor is incredibly thick. She can still thunder along at a comparable speed, and Hood was really the only ship in the arsenal that had that kind of speed to catch up with her. We also have the newly commissioned battleship HMS Prince of Wales joining alongside. Now, the problem is when Bismarck is spotted, and we're sending out everything we possibly can to try and track Bismarck down, HMS Hood was going through a refit, but this refit isn't completed. So she's going after the Bismarck with unfortunately an uncompleted refit, so she doesn't have all of the armor that she was intended to have. And even more complicated, that Prince of Wales is going out with contractors still on board, still working on her with her new turrets. So you have 2 turrets forward and 2 turrets aft, both armed with 2 15-inch guns each. Prince of Wales is slightly different, so she has 14-inch guns, but you have a turret at the front armed with 4 barrels, turret up top with 2 barrels, and then at aft you have one single turret with 4 barrels. But these are very untested, and this does become apparent during the battle. And so when Hood, commanded by Admiral Holland, when she finally catches up with them, so they spot them, this is a range of about 14 miles. So this is, sort of showing, the range of sort of gunnery that's happening. It's actually Hood that opens fire first. So spots them, opens fire first, and they're getting, the gunnery it's falling short. It's creeping close. It's creeping up. The Germans are alerted, but the Germans haven't fired back. So Hood and Prince of Wales are literally lobbing shell after shell, trying to catch up with them. But unfortunately, what's happened is that Admiral Holland has actually lined up on the wrong ship. He's lined up on Prince Eugen, and so he suddenly realizes this actually during the engagement.
I probably just, yeah,
Prince,
I bet he made the very same expression I just did.
it was that's a kind of British kind of The issue is that we're going up against Eugen and Bismarck. So Eugen is very different. She's actually a heavy cruiser, so very fast, but doesn't have the same sort of firepower and armament that Hood would have. But it's actually Prince Eugen that draws the first blood, actually. So the first shell from Eugen actually hits one of Hood's, it's a magazine, but it's for ammunition, anti-aircraft ammunition. So this starts a fire. So the Germans have found their range. They've found their mark. And from this point, the next shell that hits Hood is from Bismarck, and it actually hits her, the main part of her conning tower, killing a large number of them.
And I suppose this was at the same time where Briggs recalls being shot off the side of the ship, wasn't it?
So his account was incredibly moving. So what happens is that after the conning tower is hit, Prince of Wales is still firing, but her guns are starting to malfunction. So her turrets have started to malfunction, which is probably the last thing you need. But it is actually Prince of Wales that actually hits Bismarck. And so she does actually land a hit on Bismarck, but unfortunately Hood doesn't. And when Admiral Holland realizes that he's lined up on the wrong ship, he's thinking, I'm lined up on Eugen, he makes the order, embarks hard to port. Now, the risk you have with this, that Hood's position at the moment, actually, that she's bringing her forward guns to bear, but not her aft. So you present yourself as a far smaller target. So by making this maneuver, you're presenting a larger proportion of your ship, but you're bringing all your guns to bear, and that's what he wants to do. And some people have said, was it the wrong move to make? Was it? No, it was. It was correct. So his seamanship was spot on. His tactics were sound. Is what he was doing everything right. Then this is the fateful moment that many will know of, and it's believed it was from Bismarck's one of her aft turrets, one of her 15-inch guns, fires off, and one of these enormous 15-inch shells, they're travelling at almost supersonic speeds, lands and hits Hood. Now there are two parts to this actually. So when Bismarck makes the hit, from Prince of Wales, they describe what is an enormous column of flame just erupting from the ship. It's almost like an enormous Roman candle, just jet of flame leaping into the air. Moments later, there is an absolutely colossal explosion, and this explosion pretty much breaks Hood's back. And then this is what I mentioned, obviously, from the beginning with Indefatigable, Invincible, and Queen Mary. It's that magazine detonation. And I think I sent you over a video actually giving you that sort of comparison of the battleship HMS Barham.
Yes, you did.
Who was torpedoed by a German U-boat and then suffered a magazine detonation. And if you remember, it's that huge amount of ammunition that's stored deep beneath the bows of the ship, actually, and it's confined, and it's that explosion. It is absolutely catastrophic. And what happens is that during that explosion, and watching and reading sort of accounts from Ted Briggs, he says he recalls seeing a large sheet of flame sort of coming round the gunner's platform, and the ship begins to lift up, and they know from this point that the ship isn't coming back. She's just nothing's happening. And he does recall that when he finally came to the surface, his lasting memory of Hood's bow literally standing vertically. And if you think, obviously, this is from over an 860-foot long ship, this enormous bow sticking vertically into the air and going under. But, and some people have contested with it, but other people have said, corroborated from eyewitness accounts, that as Hood went under, her forward turret fires a final salvo, a defiant salvo against Bismarck. Now, was this because, as people think is a heroic last act of a gun crew on board actually firing for the last time, or is it a malfunction, accidental detonation firing? That's what happens. As she goes under, her forward turrets fire a final salvo as she goes under, and she is gone within absolute minutes. And the theory why the three survived, they believe, because obviously if you're in the water of the Denmark Strait, it is freezing temperatures, utterly freezing temperatures, but they actually think it was the oil that was in the water actually that sort of covered them, actually, that provided a level of insulation. And
yes, I have read about that before.
So that's the theory of it. But it was, and during, especially at the beginning of the battle, I forgot to mention at the beginning of the battle, on board Bismarck, you have Raider and Lutyens, and the captain of the Bismarck actually sort of overrode the admiral, and pretty much said, "I will not have my ship shot up from under my arse," because the British are literally firing and thumping shells over at them, actually, and the Germans haven't fired. But he overrides Raider and Lutyens, and obviously then eventually the battle ensues. This is over a range of over 14 miles. It's colossal distance, but that is sadly what Hood is known for, actually, unfortunately, during that short time of engagement, that one hit detonates the magazine and causes the huge explosion, ripping the ship into two parts and obviously then taking her down. But I said about two parts of it. So people say, oh, it's because Hood's deck armor was too thin and it plunged through a section of unarmored upper deck and straight down to the magazine. There's also another theory, that the shell from Bismarck plunged in and hit the hull of Hood below the waterline, and it was the colossal detonation, sort of shockwave reverberating through, causing the magazine detonation. So
Hmm.
there are people who sort of having conflicting views between Hood's armor was potentially sufficient to withstand. No, it wasn't. Yes, it was. It could have been this. And one thing is, I think it'd be a fascinating one actually to mention with Hood, because it really, even though for this point Hood has sunk, and the message sent to the Admiralty was literally to report said, tell them that the Hood has blown up. And that was what was sent back. And the Germans have an absolute again another propaganda field day with this actually. So everyone's going the mighty Hood sunk. Mighty Hood has been sunk. But all this has done is to anger Churchill, anger the Royal Navy, and obviously then we have the famous order of sink the Bismarck, and then we go after her. But in my opinion, with Hood's story, it doesn't end there. Because for me, and I remember it so well when I was still at school back in the dark ages, it was back in 2002, I remember watching on Channel 4 when they finally discovered the wreck.
Yes,
And,
yes, I
and
watched that recently.
it's fantastic, and in fact, it's been revisited again. So it was David Mearns who was credited with discovering the wreck of Hood. And I would urge people, if you've never watched it, I'm sure it could be found somewhere out there. But when they actually found the wreck of Hood, she was actually in three pieces. So you had her bow off one, and then her main section of superstructure is actually upside down, which is heartbreaking because we'd hoped it'd be a little bit more. But they're still trying to piece together what caused the detonation. Was it through a section of unarmored upper deck, or was it impacting against the side of the ship below the waterline, causing that fatal detonation? As you quite rightly said, obviously, where you're based down in Portsmouth, actually, I would urge people to go there to see what I consider one of the best, alongside Victory being one of the best ones out there, actually, but a fantastic artifact, and it is the Hood's bell, resides within the Museum of the Royal Navy, and I still recall watching when they finally brought it up. So the first attempt went slightly wrong, and then obviously they went back for a second attempt, and second time lucky and I was most fortunate to actually get a chance to touch the bell. And for your shop, actually, your shop also helped with my little journey. This is actually when your shop was originally based in the dockyard.
Yes.
It used to be called Antique Storehouse, and I actually acquired a bronze badge or tumpion from Hood at the time, actually. So that sits in my prided place in my collection, and I'm exceptionally proud to have it.
I'll
And
have to dig out that a couple photographs I have of Hood from Portsmouth. You'll
please
like to
do,
see
actually. I'd
them.
like to see those, actually.
And
In terms of why I'm so passionate about Hood in terms of Royal Navy, so at the beginning I said my granddad served with the Sea-class destroyer squadron in Korea, Malaya. He actually gave me a model of HMS Hood, and I was quite young, and I knew at this time I knew absolutely nothing about Hood. And my mum pointed out on the side it was a Revell kit, and on the side it had a little bit of information. It said sunk 24th of May 1941, which my mum pointed out. 24th of May is my birthday, so I thought, okay, well I thought that was novel. And then she said, well, we've actually got a link to Hood. And I said, what? She said, we had a family link. And from that point, it just, I was like, well, I want to know a little bit more. And the link we have is a man called J.E. Stokes, able seaman J.E. Stokes. But what's also fascinating, and it's also amazed me, that the number of people that I've met through years seem to have a link to Hood. With a crew company, of over 1,400. My local pub that I go to, actually, the landlord there, his family have a link to Hood. There was a friend of mine who told me that she had a family member that went down on Hood. So you'll be incredibly surprised the number of people who do have that link to HMS Hood, and it's just unfortunate that she's known mostly for her fateful event of sinking at the hands of the Bismarck, the Denmark Strait. But unfortunately, with that sinking, it does signal that is really the end of the big gun battleship. I mean, Bismarck certainly doesn't come away unscathed from the engagement, because it's Prince of Wales that manages to hit her. From that point, she's actually losing a lot of oil. And from then on, you have the famous chase, which I think that could be potentially another
Episode,
conversation
yes.
another day. Actually, another episode, actually, sort of the hunt for Bismarck in itself. No, Hood really. It's sad that she has a very short career, but she's loved by her crew. They thought that she was unsinkable. That when you hear Bismarck's out about, everyone's going, well, Hood, she'll do it. She'll
Yeah.
stand. Actually, so the pride of the nation rested on her. And for me, because I've got that little piece of Hood that I treasure, and I have that little family connection to it, and I've known so many people that have a connection to Hood. And just having that little model just kind of started it. And I think it's fascinating. But I would urge anybody, if you do think, I want to learn a little bit more, please do. Because by doing these sort of podcasts and these talks and that, we allow this kind of knowledge to flow and filter out there and for other people to suddenly find out. And then the stories continue. The stories are kept alive. Because I've always said, to forget the past will fuel future ignorance. And this is
Definitely.
really what it is, actually. So we're crusading to keep the past alive, actually. And I would say that if anybody else, has any other information they want to put forth about Hood and other, fantastic. Please do send them. If there's anything that say, oh, we want to correct you on this, fantastic. Bring it on. Actually, this is what we want. We want history is a search for knowledge and search for truth, and it changes all the time. So I would say, if anybody does have anything out there, please bring it forth.
Most definitely. And I tell you what, I must say, this episode for me anyway has been most interesting because, and I shouldn't really be saying this, but I don't know an awful amount about HMS Hood, and what happened to her. Obviously, in a nutshell, I could argue my way out of a conversation, but I most certainly couldn't hold myself as long as you have done for the past nearly 60 minutes now, and it's such a testament to our history as a nation, as well as the individual stories that surfaced from it, and unfortunately went down with HMS Hood. And you're most definitely right. If you'd like to learn a little bit more about HMS Hood, you do have the HMS Hood Association and loads of resources online to learn about her in more detail. It's been an absolutely fantastic episode of you today, Nick, and I should have really introduced this podcast as Nick's episode, but I shall battle my way through with my episode on Sicily, which will be recorded very soon. But coming
Excellent.
up on the podcast, we have a very, very well known chap called Ben Main. He'll be joining us in not too long in another episode as we discuss his introduction to the Second World War and what he does to keep history alive in Europe with a organisation called Liberation Route Europe. Well, Nick, one last thing to say. Thank you for joining us for a very British conversation. I hope to catch you next time.
Absolutely. Thank you for letting me join in on this rather British conversation, and thank you very much there, sir.